8th session of our seminar, and today we have a guest who is originally from Belgium, but who has now found a position and is teaching at the Open University in the UK. He's a senior lecturer in politics and international studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Open University, and he directs a research program on security at the Center for Citizenship, Identities and Governance, also at the Open University. I introduce to you my colleague Jeff Huysmans. Jeff Huysmans, I can say it in Dutch here, who is a political scientist with a long and impressive and actually rather diverse academic career, with teaching responsibilities in Belgium, France and the UK, and teaching responsibilities of very different natures, because at the Open University indeed teaching is especially a job that occurs in writing. He has a PhD from the University of Leuven in political sciences, and up to now he published widely on security theory, the securitization of migration, on asylum issues, on refugee issues, and on international political theory. Recent themes of his research and publications include subjects as the political construction of insecurities in the EU, politics of exception, the securitization of migration in the UK after 9/11, politics of insecurity and everyday life, and also a more theoretical aspect of his work is focusing upon critical methods in security research. More recently, Jeff Huysmans also worked on the political significance of mobility, specifically in relation to the question of European citizenship. And currently, actually, he leads a work package in an FP7, Framework 7 project called Enacting European Citizenship. And this work package is precisely on the issue of mobility and citizenship. The project that I am quoting now, Enacting European Citizenship, I think will be at the heart of his presentation of today. Today, as you can notice, there is no second speaker, which gives Jeff Huysmans more time, I would say around an hour, and after that we count on the public to replace the second voice by many other voices. Jeff, you have the floor, please.
Try to find some space. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's good to be back in Belgium for a change. At least do a lecture in Belgium, which I haven't done for a while now. Before I start, I'm going to do one little bit of advertising, just in case, because I think it might interest you if you're interested in migration security, which seems to be the general theme of the lecture series, if I have it right. Recently, in the context of another European project, Framework 6 project, under Challenge, together with Francesco Ragazzi, I actually developed a multimedia module, which has a strong component, which brings together some of the results of that kind of research, which focused on liberty and security in the European Union. But it has a component in it, which is about instituting borders, which has a number of things about migration. There's a big, long interview. I can get this working here. Yes, with DDB Welsberg Gautemans, who was central to this project. So this is a self-sustained module. It doesn't require, but it's freely available under www.libertysecurity.org module. So it brings together some of these things, but specifically the element, I mean, it covers things like exceptionalism and liberty security, but also the institution of borders and what borders are in the European Union. I'm not going to talk about this today because I'm going to talk about citizenship. And then we also have something about the changing nature of war in there. But so that's really available, and that's all my advertising. Good. Also, this is the work package. An ACT is a project under FP7 which studies what's called an acting European citizenship. And together with my colleagues Vicky Squire and Claudia Aradau, we work specifically in work package 3, which is about enacting mobility. If I can call it up, it's not that important. Yeah, enacting mobility, a more democratic European citizenship. What I'm going to talk about is basically the first 2 theoretical bits of work that we've done, specifically focusing on the first one, which is about trying to rethink mobility, not as an economic practice, not as a legal practice, but as a political practice in and of itself, and the implications for that for conceptions of European citizenship. So I'll come back to that. So the paper I'll base this lecture on is called Acts of European Citizenship, a Political Sociology of Mobility. And I have to say, this is not my work only, it's done together with Claudia Aradau and Vicky Squire. It's forthcoming in the Journal of Common Market Studies, I think in 18 months' time or something. They've got an enormous lead time before they actually get you published. So, but it's accepted. Good. This is the website for the project, so www.enacting-citizenship.eu, where you can find more about this if you want to. Good. Now let's see if I can start the slideshow here. There we go. The paper is going to cover quite a bit of ground. Much of it is going to be conceptual ground, a bit of historical sociology in the middle, and the rest is quite a bit of concepts and rethinking the concept of citizenship. Can you hear me in the back? Oh, okay. But I thought I'd start from 2 examples, and I'll try not to forget to come back, because it's a typical thing. You start with examples and then you go off in your theory and your concepts and you forget to come back. But I'll try to come back to this. The first example I want to show is something I can't even remember when it was published in Der Spiegel, is waves of would-be immigrants target EU shores. The immigrants arrive in Libya from Central Africa and from there are ferried to European shores, often by organized crime groups, in rickety, overcrowded boats. Most are trying to escape dire poverty at home. Many give up everything for the journey in the hopes that once they arrive in Europe, they will be able to support their families from afar. Now, why is this quote important? And these are the pictures that went with this article, which are the typical pictures. Now, the immigrants, you can't even see them in the boats, and the movement, the mobility that they enact is actually fundamentally depoliticized in the quote and in the pictures. There is nothing about them intentionally seeking to renegotiate structures of power. They're just presented as people who actually come. And they're a mass, a block here, basically a blurb of people on a boat that arrive. There's nothing specifically political about it. Ultimately, what the pictures do is actually try to depoliticize, to avoid any political reading of what is happening. These are people driven by, if you remember in the quote, poverty, desire for getting a better life. So it's a kind of economic immigrant that one actually presents, or sometimes they're represented as refugees as well. They're disorderly because they just come on these boats, it seems, and the order is created by human traffickers, and therefore there is a strong criminalization going on of the immigrant as well, which traditionally is another technique that's being used to actually depoliticize agents and actors. You can see that in the top right picture. That's a typical element of the criminalization. You know these pictures about offences at the border. They also depoliticize because they're seen as victims. Like, Victims from the World Economic System, victims from human traffickers, victims from whatever, and that's symbolized in the building that falls. But these people do enact mobility. They are mobile. They move from one place to the other. So part of the project that we're involved in is trying to think how to represent these forms of mobility as political acts. And so it's actually an exercise in creating a thinking space in which you have concepts available that do not draw you immediately into these three pictures, where they're victims, they're economic immigrants, or they're immigrants who just are driven by individual people, driven by particular desires, etc. They're not criminalized, but they're criminalized, and so how you can get around that. The second example about mobility, which is slightly different, is the Declaration of the Right of Sex Workers in Europe, which is another case study that we look at, which is a declaration that was elaborated and was by 120 sex workers and 80 allies, as they call them, from 30 countries at the European Conference, which was held, well, Sex Work, Human Rights, Labour and Migration, which is the conference they organized in the European Parliament in 2005. Here are a few pictures of that. I'll come back to this example as well. They do not necessarily, these people do not enact, they do not act, they're not necessarily mobile, but for sex workers and the way they problematize citizenship are the claims of rights that are performed in their manifesto and their declaration they have. They do, in a way, enact or actually problematize mobility for several reasons, which I will come back to towards the end. I mean, for sex workers, mobility is important. For the declaration, it was important not to make a distinction between immigrant sex workers and so-called third country nationals or illegals and those who are actually EU citizens according to the statutes and the codifications of citizenship. And so they actually problematized mobility, and they felt they had to do that as an act, a political act, around claiming rights of free movement and mobility, which they were not granted, in a way. And that's a political act as well. I'll come back to that because usually sex work in the European Union is heavily depoliticized, also criminalized. It is now, although it hasn't always been like that, but one of the dominant kind of framings at the moment is that sex work is connected to trafficking, and therefore policing and criminalization, which it wasn't always the case. In the 1980s, some people interviewed said the big kind of dominant element was HIV, so it became a health issue, but which was depoliticized as well because organizations who dealt with them for their rights, of course, couldn't make political statements about sex workers in terms of getting workers' rights, organizing unions, etc. They couldn't do that because they depended on government money to fund. So that is an act as well in which mobility sits. It's these two examples that I will try to talk to in a way of trying to understand how mobile acts or mobile practices are the problematization of mobility can be read as an act of citizenship. Despite the fact that according to what EU citizenship means, they don't fall necessarily under EU citizens. They're invisible as citizens. These are not citizenly acts. The immigrants coming from abroad as a body of people just arriving are not seen as acts of citizenship. They're those who are outside of the EU who want to come in, and they're just someone else. And so it's trying to think these and give a space, a certain level of legitimacy to these acts as political acts. And the same for the sex workers, who are often very invisible, they're criminalized, they don't have the rights, for example, to work, etc. In particular countries, it depends on the member states. How you can actually read these as citizen, as acts, or what we call acts of citizenship. The way I go about this, or we go about this, is try to reinterpret the relationship between mobility and European citizenship. And that's what the core of the paper is about. It's about how do we think the relationship between mobility and European citizenship. And of course the argument, the core argument is that in the European Union, there is a very close relationship between European citizenship and what's called free movement. It's actually at the core of how European citizenship is codified. It's the second article, if I'm right, in the Maastricht Treaty. Underneath, after it's stated that citizens of Europe are those who are members, or nationals of the member states. The next one is that there is a whole section on the rights of free movement, or at least a general clause about it, which has been filled in. But the argument is that the European Union, in its conception of citizenship, copies national state models of citizenship, which is the basis upon which the process of depoliticization and securitization work that I've just demonstrated with the sex workers and with the immigrants arriving. And so the question is then, can we rethink, is that all there is to mobility, this notion of free movement, as it is actually conceptualized within the European Union? Or is there another way of looking at mobility that allows to see mobile acts as inherently political? I know it's a bit abstract, but that's what I'll try to argue, as that there is a conceptual framework possible in which mobile acts in themselves can be seen as political. Good. I don't think I won't need this anymore now. So I might come back to that later on. Good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk in 3 sections. The first section is quickly setting out how we see the conception, the relation between free movement and European citizenship. But that's important because, of course, we make an argument that we want to move away from that, so we'll first set out how we see that one. Then I'll make 2 moves. One is about the rethinking of mobility, not as cross-border movement, because that's the way it's defined in the EU. It's moving across borders of states. That's free movement of mobility. That's not how we see it. Mobility is re-theorized through Zimmer's sociology as being a certain particular form of bonding of people, of binding people together in exchange relations. I'll come back to that. Which is a different way, where you're bonded not because you're a member of a territorial cultural unit, like the European Union or a nation state, and therefore if you move across, that's when you move. That's what movement is about, and mobility. No, it's being involved in exchange relations with other people. That's what mobility is. And that will be the basis upon which we then can make a second move, where we move from citizenship as a status that's being granted, or that you have as an element of rights and belonging, a certain collection of rights and belonging that are given by the European institutions, to what we call acts of citizenship, which are particular practices that basically rupture or create some form of disorder in relation to the institution of citizenship, to the statuses. So it's based on this kind of streaming of literature, I don't know that you've come across that, which tries to think citizenship politically rather than as a legal or quasi-legal status that you have, but as a practice that is fundamentally connected to the idea of democracy as an argument about having equal rights, or at least have the right to claim rights in relation to an existing institutionalized setting, and therefore you can break it open. So that's the 2 moves I make. But let's start with the European Union. In the EU, to some extent, free movement is driven by economic reasoning. It's an economic issue. Is that what's embedded in the 5 free movements? It changes over time, but it's the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. That's what it is. So it's a social kind of, socio-economic reading of free movement in the first instance. But of course, if you go back to the original ideas, which is specifically captured in functionalist and what one sometimes calls transactionalist readings of European integration, is that, of course, free movement was expected to create a we feeling, some kind of recognition between the people from different countries in Europe. So, somehow, mobility is a vehicle for transcending national identities. And therefore you could build a European people on the grounds of which you could then build a European political community. So So you would create a certain demos, in political science language, a European political demos, on the basis of people moving about. And so free movement is, or mobility, but in this case it's free movement, is a kind of creates opportunities for developing a European political identity that then actually could spill over in claims for a political community. But from the moment on, one thinks European citizenship in relation to free movement, and citizenship is of course one of the key vehicles through which one actually tries, some people call a spillover, tries actually to politicize and bring in this kind of spillover to a political community. From that moment on, mobility in a certain sense sits in the background. It remains a set of rights that's been given, but the big debates, specifically if you look in the context of European studies, are about other things. The big debates about European citizenship are about the democratic deficit. It's about the absence of having a European people. How do we create a European people? How can we gain legitimacy of the institutions by speaking to Europe's people? And therefore, you've got the whole process of legitimization that's coming in. How can we create a European public sphere and European public institutions in which the voice of the citizens can be heard? This has not necessarily to do with mobility. This has to do with instituting that what is central to any understanding of a democratic polity about the question of legitimacy to its citizens. So in a certain sense, mobility disappears at that moment, despite being at the heart of the legal element, the legal codification of citizenship rights. In the debates about what citizenship is supposed to do, it disappears in the background. And what the European Union is then doing, and that's the important thing for us, is that's why I say free movement, I mean we can come back to that, remains in the background. In a sense you could say it's in the foreground as well, but it remains in the background in relation to what I'm going to say in about 5 minutes' time. Because what the translation of what the political problematique is about constituting the political problematique of citizenship, is about constituting a European polity, which mirrors the way national states constitute political community. Which means that, as I said, the key issues are territorial borders, the protection of a territorial entity. The EU as a territorial entity, even if, I've seen that Elspeth Galt has been here, maybe she talked about that, even if policing is at a distance, for example in the embassies where they give visas, you still control the entrance into a particular territory. So there's a territorialized identity with external borders, to which one tries to build a community. There is a strong cultural and value orientation as well in trying to get people in trying to reproduce things like a national anthem, a flag, but also for people to be mobilized as political subjects, members of the political community, and a strong distinction between, at least in the rhetorics, between third country nationals and those who are citizens of the EU, which are often then actually explained, and there's a very strong value discourse going on, about that people should, and the EU should represent a certain Europeanness that it claims, which is of course highly contested because there are other ways in which Europe is claimed, but that's another discussion. But it's what one calls, what we call with Ayse's work, a scalar model of citizenship. It's where you move the European citizenship problematique. It's very much one where you move from nation states as a level up to a European level, but you reproduce the same kind of conception of what citizenship actually aspires to mean. So, in a certain sense, you try to reproduce a nation-state Europe somehow as the model around which you problem what European citizenship means. And much of the debate about European citizenship in the literature is precisely because you have two levels that are in competition about claiming citizens. And that's the whole that's part of the post-national citizenship literature a la Huysmans, which is indeed about this, that you've got two levels. And how can you move beyond the nation-state claiming exclusive loyalty of their citizens to where they actually have to work with their own citizens, but these citizens at the same time are citizens of the European Union. But the model of what the EU is and European citizenship is indeed a citizenship that moves across a particular territory between particular states. Citizens that are protected abroad when they are abroad from the EU territory, and citizens that are expected, they're not, of course, hence the frustration, they don't express Europeanness, but are expected in the longer term to become a kind of European demos in which one can vest political legitimacy of the European Union. Now, why is that problematic? From the perspective of my migrants, the migrants I showed in the very beginning, and the sex workers, it is problematic, because what such an understanding of citizenship does, it actually institutes a demand or an imperative for boundary drawing, very sharp boundary drawing, at least the political rhetoric do show. I know in the very practices it's a bit more messy than it is, but in the political rhetorics at least, it is actually a very sharp boundary drawing. Because citizenship is seen as membership of this territorial kind of culturally defined, where the culture doesn't have to be the nation, it could also be some kind of value orientation towards universal rights or whatever that are embedded in the institutions. So it's a very strong boundary drawing, and that's where the legitimacy of security practices to some extent comes from. It's at that moment you have to, what security practices do, they're part of the boundary, they're not the only practice of boundary drawing, but they're probably one of the most visible ones because they often go hand in hand with quite a bit of violence and spectacular kind of actions that go on. But it's a boundary drawing between those who are fully citizens, those who are lesser citizens, and those who are no citizens at all. And so, specifically in lines then with those who are dangerous. But it's not the only way of boundary drawing. There's a whole lot of boundary drawing that goes on in cultural politics as well. Which cultures can be European cultures? Which cannot be European cultures? What does it mean to be European? What values do you need to profess to be a European citizen? It also draws a very strong element between an internal and external element, which is what the symbolic politics of the border are about. Whatever the border controls have, as long as it's expressed as borders, it is very much about trying to identify a territorial identity. And so that's, in a certain sense, problematic. It also leads to the constitution of the European Union as not a security community, but as a community of insecurity. Citizenship is fundamentally embedded in an insecurity about who are the members and who they're not. And hence the centrality to some extent. It's not that, well, hence the centrality of security practices and this practice of policing and so on. So in a certain sense, the way European citizenship and the political aspirations of the European Union are formulated are actually a ground, a fundamental basis upon which security practices and within which security practices thrive to some extent. Not only, I've said there's all the boundary drawing, but security practices are probably, and they're very central. I mean, the EU is now an internal security project, which has been done. The question then becomes, is there a way of understanding citizenship differently in relation to mobility? Mobility as a ground for citizenship that could give some political status and legitimacy to people moving across territories, moving within the labour market, people who professionally, even if they're seen as a debate about whether sex work is seen as work or not, that they can make political claims about the right to hold rights in relation to the EU. That's the normative political project that's in here and to which I'll start working in the next 20 minutes. There's another element to it, which is that this is a very interesting way of reading free movement or mobility, as that thing that sits at the basis upon which you then can construct a nation kind of state or organic community kind of project of the European Union, but itself sits in the background. So that what's the basis the movements, which are supposed to create the refeelings and supposed to create the interdependencies, upon which you then can start building a political community, is itself, remains largely seen as an economic kind of practice, a practice that takes place, etc. But the heart of the political debates are about the construction. The hearts of European citizenship debates are about the construction of a European demos, a European territory, etc., what that means. Which then means that the social force that creates the conditions of possibility is itself, cannot itself be seen as a political force that can make critical political claims upon the way one goes about instituting European citizenship. And of course that's a particular interesting reading because mobility, as I'll do in the next step in the first move, in terms of what's called modernity, the shift that happened in the 16th, 17th century towards modernity, mobility has always been in tension, fundamentally in tension to integrationist visions of political communities that define themselves territorially and gradually in the 19th century around nationalism as well. And mobility has remained all the time something through which people got in connection with one another, acted, sometimes like the mobile mob who mobilized, sometimes politically made arguments by just moving about, is actually almost erased from this picture of politics. And that I'll try now, in the first step that I'm now going to do, I'll try to recover that understanding of mobility by relying on Zimmel's work, who is for those of you who don't know him, is one of the, it's one of the big names in the historical sociology together with Weber, Marx and Durkheim, but there's also a lesser one, although that has changed recently in the sense that it's not necessarily taught as the big one because he doesn't have a similar, his corpus is much more, well, some people say postmodern, it's a bit all over the place, some say. But he is a very big name. He was part of the very big debates about when sociology was actually where it originated from. So we'll rely on him. That's not to give this reading authority. We're not like espousing Zimmel as an uncritical one, but he is a source that actually allows us to recover mobility in a different way from free movement as a status in the EU. And then I'll do the second move a bit later on, where we actually move from citizenship as a status to citizenship as an act. Good. Let's see, where are we? As I said, free movement as a form of mobility is heavily territorially defined. It's about crossing borders between nation states and facilitating, or trying to exactly not facilitate, in some level, the crossing of borders. And therefore the migration problematic, it's not a mobility between the city and the rural areas. That's not what it is. It's cross-border. It's between states, and especially national states, that it is defined. But Zimmel doesn't ground mobility and movement, and he doesn't conceptualize it in the first instance in that way. And he goes back, he says, the fundamental historical change that took place is not this, that you actually have nation states and then you have to move between them. That's mobility. He starts from an understanding of exchange between people, which is it's philosophy of money. So it's an economic kind of understanding. It's an intervention in economic debates. It's where I give you something and you give me something that we have. And in that relationship of exchange, you sacrifice, I sacrifice something because you have something I would like. And you have sacrificed something and you get something in return. That's an exchange relationship, and that's what constitutes, what changes people from a simple collection of individuals to an inner bond between men, as he says. So it's in the exchange is the basis for understanding mobility. So let me now work that out. It's based on a historical transformation, which is actually quite complex. But it goes back, I mean, it's very difficult to time because he's not very clear on the timing where he places it. But let's say 15th, 16th century and a bit later, where there was an intensified circulation of goods and services, which became possible because property relations from land ownership and from membership of the mobility, property relationships became detached from actually owning land or being attached to the land or being a member of the nobility. So which basically meant, the example that he gives is that vassals in the feudal system could actually sell their rights, and they would get money and they would be free from the land, and therefore they could move on and, for example, could become merchants who could move across places without being bound to this kind of vassal kind of relationship you had with the lord and the land upon which you worked in that way. And that allowed an increased circulation of goods and services. That's what it means. And of course the central element here becomes money. Because it's through money, it's an idealized view of money. It doesn't work historically like that, but it's important for the argument to recover a notion of mobility as differences. That money makes it possible for me to be detached from the land and the products that are produced on the land. From me being attached to a particular guild and doing some kind of crafting, but I could only do that as a member of that particular guild, and I was bound to it in my whole person. Not just I go to work and then I do something else. No, I am part of the guild and bound to it. But from the moment on if I can detach to actually selling money and can move about with the money to buy later on something else, I can circulate. I can move. And that's very important. That's the underlying element where he says at that moment, and that's what we theorize as mobility, is this capacity to circulate on the basis, and money plays an important role, but there's this element of not being tied in as a full person, as a citizen, to a particularly organically or guild-like defined, or in stratified communities like nobility, defined community to which you're bound. And so you enter in exchange relationships with all kinds of people, and you bond with them in some form in the exchanges that you make. And the important element for the later on the political reading is that the very fact that money remains abstract, that it doesn't have any value in and of itself, it only has value in the exchange that you perform. At that moment you can have a leveling effect, meaning, what I just said, that there is an element of equality. If I have money and you have money, we're in a certain sense we can exchange at the level of equality. It doesn't in a certain sense matter. Again, historically that's not how money works, we can come back to that. But it's important to recover. There is something to it, that money therefore is an element where those who were in a hierarchical relationship and a subordinated suddenly can actually become exchanging with one another in a horizontal relationship. Right? And that's what money does, in a certain sense. Money is central. I mean, as I said, it's very much, it's not just money, it's also, I mean, the change in property relationship and the nobility had not only to do with money. It had to do with a whole lot of complex struggles that were going on and changes, historical changes. But it's the issue of money and the leveling effects that's really important, because mobility becomes this horizontal element where we start being connected as strangers, to use another of Symbol's terms. Yes? Whereby our identity, our status, does not come from being a member of or a citizen of a community, but from exchanging and being in relation to one another. And thereby, at that moment, we transform from just being a group of bodies into some kind of society, or what he calls a form of sociality. So it's not to have society, because society is very much bound with the tradition of the nation-state, nation-state thinking, state-society relations. That means, I don't know whether you can follow this, we can come back to this, but that's what mobility is. If you're actually fully embedded in understanding the current issue of migration, it's an awkward understanding of theorizing mobility, because usually mobility is just seen as the movement across borders. The fluidity, the nomadism that one has, which is a negative force. Simply, it receives its status from just being exactly that. That's what's not bound by the communities. But in here, I think what we're trying to say is that mobility itself creates forms of sociality which can be different, and in exchange relations should be conceptualized as different from being a citizen of a kind of political community as defined around territory, culture, to which you belong, because a citizen is a whole person. You are not supposed to be a citizen. Well, dual citizenship is a very controversial issue at the moment. You're supposed to be a person that belongs somewhere, not someone who floats about and bonds to other people in the exchanges and gains from that actually a certain political status. And that's the move which we try to make to Zimmel. So we are actually, when we speak mobility, we actually do not speak free movement. And in a way we have to use the concept separately. Because the way mobility is exactly not free movement in the way as a crossing of borders. Because it could be the mobility where, for example, sex workers move from one city to the other, which in some countries are not allowed to do, right? To exchange. To be successful in the sex workers industry, you move about. So at that moment you have bonding. So it is not a concept of mobility that's bound and that has its heart in the crossing of boundaries. And therefore migrants do not emerge, and so we're back to the migration theme, as mobile because they cross borders, but because they're agents in the circulation of services and goods and the production of social relations of exchange. And so they're more likely to become bonded to other people on the ground of these exchanges and the exchange values that they create because of physically and socially moving across spaces. And therefore we flatten out. We try to flatten out citizenship. Now of course, and it's repeating, but I want to drive this home, is it's not original to, of course, start off with these pictures. It's recognized that migration are indeed always creates signs where citizenship is contested. And of course, to some extent, much of the European integration, European citizenship debates do actually are concerned and are fought out over issues of migration to some extent. That's recognized. But what we try to introduce is not just a problematic of migration. That's why I have, and I will in the conclusion just do the sex workers case, why we talk about sex workers as a case, is that the political struggle of European citizenship, or they are actually not between the inside and an outside, but are about tensions that emerge between mobility based on exchange relationships and the bonding that exists and creates there as purely exchange, without creating a certain feeling we are all Europeans, and the demand for a kind of organic, territorially cultural conception of citizenship. That's there. And so Zimmel does that work for us, to introduce this kind of concept as a vehicle to rethink mobility. Good. I can't remember how long I've spoken, but I'll need another probably 10 minutes or so. Of course, now you can say, that's all fine and well, but that's typically the sociological move that you make. Interaction itself is political. Now, political scientist move is not about that. There is to be somehow, and in a certain sense, Zimmel recognizes this as well. And let me try to formulate it this way. So we have now this Zimmelian conception of mobility, about exchange relationship. And you say, well, you know, that's fine. That's what the EU has as well. Although it's true, they cordon it off, right? But that's the political act that they perform. That's what you said in the beginning. When you have free movement across borders and economic exchange, then you spill over into a desire for political community by some people, and then they start building politics on top of the social relations and try to actually build a political community. So in other words, what that means is mobility has to be claimed politically. You can't just say that this mobility is in and of itself political. And that's where we need our second move, because that's what the concept of citizenship fundamentally is about. It's about the constitution of political being, not just of socioeconomic being, but of political being, of trying to think what politics is about from the side of people, individuals, their acts, their mobilities in this case. And in that sense, if you remember, I said that money had this leveling effect. So I thought hierarchical relationships from me being a servant or subordinate or a citizen that actually has to be legitimate or is governed by, two, I'm exchanging with other people. And so there is a kind of leveling horizontally. There is an element of equality to that. And that's a funny thing to say about money, given the whole critique we have had about money in the last 150 years. But still, there is an element in which money frees people and makes a certain level of equality. Now, that leveling needs to be claimed politically as a ground upon which you can actually claim rights to have rights. Because we interact, because we exchange, there is a right to have rights for us. So if we move across the seas to pick fruit somewhere, there is a right for us to have rights because we're bonded to you, in a way. Not as nationals, not as we're not Europeans, it doesn't matter, but we're bonded. That claim, that leveling, has to be claimed. That's where we introduce another concept by Ayse and also Greg Nielsen, which is called acts of citizenship. And I emphasize acts of citizenship. It's a peculiar concept which tries to shift the focus from understanding citizens as subjects with a particular status, often a legal status of rights that you have. As a European citizen, I have particular rights, which, as Elspeth Guild argues very interestingly, which I can claim by crossing the border. Because most of the European rights you can connect it to free movement. You can claim, but you have to move across borders. So, but there is an element, a body of rights that you can claim as a citizen. That is the status definition of European citizenship. So acts of citizenship is not about that. It works against it. It tries not to see citizenship as a granting or a relationship based on the status. Neither does it try to see it in terms of, but I'm not going to go into that because that's a bit more ambivalent discussion, a bit more complicated to explain, as a norm, as just a practice through which you actually start to act out on things that have been going on for a long time. Like, for example, after a certain moment, gender equality is recognized and you start enacting the script of gender equality and extending it. That's not what acts of citizenship are about either. So it's not a practice term in citizenship studies or in the understanding of citizen. It's really about trying to think and to make visible certain acts, certain practices, certain actions that are taken which rupture, deviate, create a disorder. I'll give you an example. When in 1998 or 1997, I think, when about 400 to 800, there's a controversy over the numbers, of Roma people, Roma, actually moved into the UK, there was a whole kind of thing. There was just bodies moving in. Some claimed asylum, some didn't. But suddenly there was a whole debate in Europe, triggered by this, about all kinds of things, like discriminations in the Czech Republic. Like what the EU should do with its new accession states, like Czech and Slovakia. So, yes. So you have this kind of debate that opens up by the pure movement. And therefore, the movement itself ruptures something about the political identity and the structures that are there. Now, if this movement can be read as an element of the right to claim rights, it actually distorts. It's a moment of citizenship that is not defined by enacting a status or an already semi-recognized script of practices that is possible, but really something that should not be seen as citizenship, as political, right? Like the immigrants moving, being stopped at the border, being criminalized, being policed, etc. You keep it away from politics. That's what the concept of acts of citizenship tries to bring in. That is a constitutive practice of what citizenship means. It opens up sites where citizenship is constituted, discussed, but precisely constituted, reconstituted, because something happens that actually produces a crack in the system, or several cracks. And it's that kind of element that then has to give, is part of what European citizenship and how Europe is constituted as a citizenry entity. So that's what acts of citizenship do. And for us then, what we do is, and that's why I mean, in this paper that I present, we don't talk about immigrants, we talk about the sex workers, but I wanted to give you this, just a movement of bodies across the sea to the land, because that's a very strong image about how mobility itself can then claim, and it's not necessarily claimed by the immigrants themselves, It can be claimed it's usually when you look at this, it's incredibly messy what's going on. But it's claimed as an act of rights to hold rights. And therefore you open up a political space, and that's part of what European citizenship should be, or has to be. It's an act of citizenship. It's the act where new political subjects try to be formulated, or formulate themselves as new political subjects, who have a bearing upon what it means to be European in this case. Right? And that's what is brought in. And that's how we see mobility. That's the challenge, and partly the originality of the whole project, in the whole ACT project, is to think the physical movement of people, or the claiming of mobility as exchange, as a ground, and the leveling effects it creates, the claims of equality it allows, as moments for performing acts of European citizenship. And in the last few minutes, let me come back very quickly to the Declaration of the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe. I'm not going to linger long there. This is a typical act, to some extent, although it's a bit a complex one, but as all acts are. Sex workers across, for a whole year, they met, I can't remember whether it was in South Africa the first time or somewhere else, and there was this idea we have to just get ourselves organized and make a statement about the very fact that we have a right to hold rights. They don't use that language, but it's so common. They had certain rights, so they claimed a certain element of status as well, but they also claimed the whole idea that, and that's the right to hold rights, as a sex worker we do work, right? And we should be able to move freely within the EU, but also immigrant workers work as well. So there is this element of workers that actually claim some right because they work, because they are involved in actionism. And that should be there. So we make a statement. And they organized in the European Parliament an event, which is this one, a conference, in which they actually formulated the declaration and the manifesto, sex workers, that's there. Now, in this manifesto and the declaration, they reclaim mobility on the grounds I've just outlined. They actually argue, I mean, it's more than just about mobility, it's about all kinds of rights. It's a whole plethora of rights that they're engaging with. But part of it is that they actually do question and try to produce a crack in the way free movement is connected to citizenship. By, for example, not restricting free movement of individuals, in this case sex workers, between states on the grounds of their engagement in sex work. Because it is true that sex work is not recognized as work, and thereby you are not allowed to move freely between the states, among others. So they're actually reclaiming that form of mobility. And it depends on the nation states. So they reclaim a right to move freely in that way as workers. So they claim certain mobility and make a critical political claim on these grounds, precisely on the grounds that they are mobile and have to be mobile because of their industry. As one of our interviewees says, basically, to be successful in the sex work industry, you have to move. New faces have to be at the same sites. You can't stay forever. There is literally an example about, in certain jobs, you prosper when you stay and move up in the hierarchy. In sex work, you have to move. No, it's not unique in that sense. There are other jobs where you have to move to become successful. But to do that, you have to move. So they have to claim mobility for themselves as part of what they are in the actionist relationship. And the second thing they did in relation to mobility is actually making a very strong, there was a whole discussion about this, that the same rights for migrant sex workers, from wherever they come, precisely because they work. And so that's, in that sense, this is an act of citizenship in the way I've tried to explain it, through which one does, in a certain sense. One doesn't act mobile, but one claims mobility and the leveling effects that are connected to this understanding of mobility that I've just presented. And that should be seen as, or it should be seen as an act of European citizenship. It's constituted, and at that moment, the declaration turns those subjects, in this case sex workers, this was self-organized by sex worker organizations. There's not some kind of other persons that come in and say, oh, let's speak in the name of the sex workers. They're representatives from within. That they turn the subjects who are often seen as, currently especially, this came up specifically in a context where trafficking became a dominant discourse. There was a shift in how sex work was treated. and it became a very strong shift in the direction of criminalizing through the trafficking approach. That at that moment, those subjects were either seen as criminals, are illegals, are victims, those who are, you know, these, they don't have really projects on their own, they just lured into by criminal organizations who then actually bring them to a town, and then they're actually kind of semi-slavery put, and then they're put on the streets. So they can never appear as people with a project on their own. That's there. There's very interesting work by my colleague Rosita Andrijašević on this, who has actually done ethnographic research with how people have their own project and how diverse they are in terms of how these people, at that moment when they declare, they try to position themselves as new political subjects, as a move, as a critical move, to produce a crack explicitly in relation to the trafficking framing of sex work. And that's, I think, what this project actually tries to come down to, is tries to think European citizenship, not in the usual kind of way as between the two levels, that then we have then to see whether we are a European citizen of the nation, then the external borders, how do we manage membership of citizenship. But really actually try to show that sides of European citizenship are constituted where acts of citizenship take place, where those who are invisible or kept invisible as political subjects articulate themselves as political subjects. And that are sites where citizenship is constituted, reconstituted, not always successfully or effectively, etc. That's not the point, but it's the opening that's there and the legitimacy that's given to these sites. Thank you.
Danger that this definition of mobility as acts of citizenship cuts on two edges. And I will try to explain that by saying that from the point of view of migration policy in traditional terms, the only solution actually might be not to impeach acts of citizenship by building walls, for example. So rendering impossible migration from a policy point of view would then, create a necessity to render factual mobility impossible in order to take out the plug of any possible act of citizenship. And I fear a little bit that the image of the walls of the barbed wire walls of Melilla are the expression of such a stance towards mobility. Impeach mobility, impeach citizenship just by turning your back and refuse the exchange that is proposed. Maybe I got something wrong, but I think that might lead to a form of radicalization of policies. But it's just something I want to drop in order to open the discussion.
Let me tackle it in two different ways. One of the elements is that the walls are not possible in a certain way, right? They're real politics, they're real violence that takes place, but they're also an impossibility, because it's not the case. That's why mobility is a fundamental, that's why we went back to doing this talk, there's a theory about this, that there is a change in societies, where societies became, that's why the change in property relationship bounded to the land is so important, why the market is so important. That there is practice going on all the time, which is exchange, and which is transversal, in the sense that it's not bound to territorial and community-based identities. You don't have to do globalization to do that. It's just transactions are going on all the time in elements. So the walls can't work in that way. So that would be then the element. So what's actually happening, you could argue, that would be one of the arguments that's said, is that the walls are actually a practice. It's not necessarily intentionally done, but a practice that constitutes, therefore, those exchanges which are seen, which are happening, prevents them from becoming political. It's a practice, it's a technique of exactly saying, that's not where citizenship can be contested, where political being can come into being, where subjects can start articulating themselves as political subjects. There's a paradox, of course, that the walls exactly create the site where one starts politicizing issues of citizenship. But the walls are in that sense a reality, but also an impossibility in terms of that. The second reason why there is so much about exchange, I think, which is interesting for the European Union, is that the European Union, of course, defines itself fundamentally as being located. That's the ambivalence about it. It has a desire for being a kind of nation state. Not necessarily in the tradition, in the form that it all fits together well, but there is a project in there, an integrated project. Let's call it an integrated notion of citizenship. But it also is a project that is fundamentally driven. It could be economically, but it doesn't have to be. It's also about tourism, exchange. So it functions on the facilitation of exchange and the recognition. And the way the kind of conceptual argument that we have with European studies is that from the moment on you actually place European citizenship debates, immediately again, it's a level question between levels, you actually eradicate exactly what the walls do as well, is that exchanges are claimed politically. They have leveling effects, or sometimes also have stratifying effects, but they take place. And they are often, like declarations, like sometimes people, there's work by Peter Myers in Canada about, this is much more about refugees and so on, and clandestine immigrants, actually doing kind of direct action, but they claim political subjectivity at that moment. And so from the moment on in European studies that you do the leveling, that citizenship, which stands indeed for that what can be a legitimate political subject, and for therefore where political sides can emerge, from the moment on you do that, you eradicate one of the fundamental processes, social processes, in modernity and late modernity, that take place and where practice take place. You only allow politics to emerge in an already territorialized sense, and not in an exchange sense. And therefore you take away, you actually insert, if you do think society-polity relation, you actually cut off a whole section of that what constitutes the social from becoming political. And therefore it's important to reconceptualize citizenship in the EU, so they have a recognition that political being, that people can come to become political in other sides than the already territorialized and culturalized ones. And that's why it's a move. And of course, what politically means, of course that means, there's all kinds of questions that emerge from this kind of conception. One of them is, what's a political reaction to this? On the other hand, this conception is not necessarily very original. It's original on the theory of mobility, that I'm convinced by, after what we've seen of how mobility is actually theorized in sociology. But of course there is a whole lot of work on the sans-papiers in France, which actually works on, not on mobility, but on similar kinds of openings of political sites in a different way. Those who cannot claim political subjectivity, how they claim it and become it, and what they do, and so on. So this paper sits in there. Now what political reactions to that are, that's the struggle. But we think in terms of the way, if one tries to understand and study the enactment of European citizenship, it's important to retain a conceptual place for these practices. That's...
Thank you. Leaving the floor to the audience. Someone has questions.
Could you please give your own definition of citizenship, the political definition?
The definition here is claims for the right to hold rights. That's it. So it's a claim. Politics becomes about claims of social justice. We rely here in some way on Ayse's work. That's what he does. That's what political being is about. It's claims of social justice. We do in another paper, for which I can give you the reference, where we actually work this up. It's not a definition of citizenship as membership. It's a definition of citizenship as a particular kind of action that takes place. And this action is indeed the right to claim rights.
And what makes people eligible to claim rights? Why can they claim? When can they claim?
You can't. That's the wrong question. That's eradicating the act, because the eligibility is already starting from a status that actually through which you can. The eligibility, there is an eligibility that comes, but it's a different one. It's a democratic one. That's what we do in the other paper, where we trace it back to the understanding that democratic citizenship is partly about the rights you have in the contract with the rulers or the Leviathan or whomever, what kind of theory you also use, or the state. That's the status conception. But democratic citizenship has also a tradition of being excessive all the time to this kind of eligibility, because it's the power and the sovereignty of the people, which has a fundamental claim of equality, hence the leveling, that's embedded in that notion of citizenship. And therefore you claim rights, to hold rights, as a human being or as a particular being. And that allows you to claim it. We theorize that later on. That's why we can recover. What we do is recovering the concept of the mob, which in English works, is the mobilizing people, right? Who are in democratic thinking usually made invisible. Much of democratic theory is precisely about trying to not let them emerge in democratic practice. But there is a claim there about equality as a human being, as a leveling effect, in our case, of being in exchange relationship, on grounds of which you claim the right to hold rights. You claim justice claims as a legitimate claim. You try to make these claims legitimate. That's what it is about. So if you say, what's the grounding? That's the ground, that's the political grounding, which is a historical traditional grounding. It's always a battle and a struggle. But it cannot be a legitimity in terms of an already instituted status, because that runs precisely against what the concept of actual citizenship tries to make visible. It's that what produces an uneasiness, an uncertainty, or a crack in that what is the status and instituted. So I can answer the question of what makes it illegible, but it's not an element of it's not a legal argument at all, and not an argument in terms of status or contract. It's another argument. It's an argument about mobilizing claims as political subjects, drawing on a tradition. In this case, exchange relationships and the leveling effects they have, and say, look, we are here, we do this, we are part of social bonding as strangers in there. Therefore, we claim rights to hold rights, and that's the act of citizenship. That's where you become a political subject. And citizenship is about empowering political subjects. On the one hand, it's the argument about this structure of domination, about separating those who are legitimate, real citizens from those who are lesser are no citizens. But actual citizenship is very much about that. Citizenship also has an ambivalence. It's empowering because it has these grounds of and core, which goes back to sovereignty of the people, to some extent, in its non-nationalist rendition. It goes back to that as a ground for claiming equalities and therefore illegibility and legitimacy of making claims. I don't know whether that's clear to you, but that's the answer.
Maybe I can pursue this question a little bit. What is actually? I sense there must be a difference, but I can't formulate it for myself. What would be the difference between your position here to defend the right to claim rights as a result of an act of citizenship? What is the essential or conceptual difference with universalist human rights discourse? Saying we are all human, we have all rights.
That's going to be a long answer, because that's part of the second. No, maybe it's not that long, but it has to go into... there is a difference, there's not a difference. There is a difference if human rights discourse is a rights discourse. Therefore, it actually opens up legal sides. Now, legal sides already codify a status, which can function in relation. For example, the critique of human rights is because it's universal, and therefore it functions against an already a body of rights in terms of national citizenship, for example, European citizenship. So that's that. But what rights do is they draw you into a kind of legal system where you individualize, very often. To make them effective, you enter a legal system in which you claim my right. That's an argument you can actually say. Why, for example, when the example I gave of the Roma coming to the UK, when they claim asylum, they're taken over by the lawyers. Therefore, it becomes each individual who is taken up in a particular kind of framing, because you have to make legal claims that are recognizable as legal claims to be there. Thereby, you take away the collective dimension of the struggle, which is central to acts of citizenship. It's not necessarily me as an individual, it's the movement as a collective element that opens up the site. So there is a problematique about rights in terms of the individualizing element, or what some people call, what Pierre Bourdieu calls, I think, where you do the struggle between or over collective stakes is turned into a mediation between partners. And so the hard political question is often partly eradicated by being taken out. Now that's what legal system does. So that's not a fully correct reading of how human rights works in the political scene, but it nevertheless functions very heavily in that. And our sex workers, for example, also see that human rights are not necessarily a good thing for claiming herein. We got an interview with someone who worked on human rights in relation to sex work and said they have been used against the rights for sex workers as well, precisely because they turn them into victims. They cannot express a political voice on their own without being turned into a human rights discourse, which has particular parameters within which you can formulate it. And therefore, acts of citizenship is indeed a conception that works on a certain practice, in this case being mobile or claiming mobility in itself, and tries to retain the collectivity, the kind of cracking interaction that you have. Now, obviously, that does not mean, and if you read these cases, like the sex work case, but also we've just started studying the Roma in Italy, and then the whole politicization of that one. Of course, there is a lot of rights claims that are being made. And of course they draw on human rights to some extent. But you do not limit it to human rights in that way. I mean, it's much more, the opening of the site has to remain a non-legalized site to some extent. Because otherwise acts become the articulation of two statuses against one another, which are there. And the crack has to come. That's why in the other paper we recognize that where mobility constitutes this kind of political site is at the interstices between indeed the human rights, universalistic discourses and practices that take place, and the practices of the mob. Now the mob is a provocative term we use, but it's a placeholder for those practices of those who are not allowed in the legal system. Now, often they're violent, but not necessarily violent. It's those who cannot enter that kind of practice. And they have to remain there. Because otherwise there is a problem with the kind of embracing of human rights, which is that one forgets they are about rights, and one forgets the whole political and sociological critique of how legal systems function, and the limits of expressing politicality through the legal system. In precisely what it does. It does eradicate, to some extent, collectivity. Not necessarily so. There are other reasons, for example, of the class struggle, where one of the reasons why one introduced the social welfare state is precisely because one was effectively using the conflictual relationships in the legal system about accidents at work, together with the mobilization indeed on the street. And the legal system reinforced the conflictual relationship, and therefore is there, so we needed another system. Now that's a particular reading of how the relationship is messy. But it's important. Our project is very much, and I mean, the reason why that project is there, why we go to thinking citizenship as mobilization and retaining the collective dimension and the collective stakes of social justice that are expressed, is that, of course, there is a certain smuggliness in our certain kind of self-satisfactory claim in the European Union that we do, from the critical angles, we do embrace human rights. Not necessarily by the institutions, also by the people who do the critical practices. We have the capacity in the European Court of Justice to go through human rights claims. So therefore, the Court of Justice becomes central. But what do you do? I will never forget in this project challenge that I mentioned before, when Anastasia Caglar, who actually studies hooligans, said, all these lawyers talk a lot about refugees, but what do they do with the hooligans, whose free movement and human rights were also violated? So there are elements in which human rights are politically played and actually do, besides what I said, that they frame subjects into back of the legal subjects with all the consequences it has for the capacity for political articulation. Because what do you do with those who are not allowed, or are such constructed in such a way, as beasts, for example, that they are not allowed into the human rights framework? And that's why that you cannot think sides of acts of citizenship and political sides purely in the tension between human rights post-national kind of identity and the national kind of European citizenship body of statuses, and you need to retain something like acts based on conceptions of laws that cannot be captured, because these have to be visible as well and constitute historically sites where citizenship is formulated.
Thanks a lot. More questions? Yeah. Thanks.
I missed the word duty. Now, duty, is that only connected to a membership model of citizenship, or what? I think that's one of the main issues, political issues, is duties. Yes, rights to claim, fine, but many situations involve paying back or creating something that you can claim from collectively. So collective products in the welfare state involve duties to pay taxes. So I didn't hear the word duty a single time. So where does that aspect of politics come in this story?
That's a good question, but we haven't talked duty at all. That's because I can explain you why that is, and I think there will be a resistance, but the next time when we have a meeting, a conceptual meeting, I'll throw it on the table to see what we do with that concept. And we don't do that because we're on the element of actually producing the cracks in the rights claims. It's those who are invisible, or are fundamentally discriminated against, and cannot claim the citizenship, some form of citizenship, somehow. That actually is what we bring in. That's the project. That's both the conceptual project in European studies, the conceptual project in political theory, but also the political project that runs through this. That should be recognized. At that moment, of course, duties are not there, because that throws you back into the contract theory, which locks you into the negotiation of the status. That does not mean that that's not important from the moment on, because there is an ambivalence, I can throw that on the table. This is based as a project on the resistance to go into that debate, which does not mean to say that that debate is not important. But the project itself will not enter that, because it's about instituting the status again. While it's actually interesting in actually trying, first of all, to recognize that there are sites where these debates are not central in a way, which is about opening up discussions about politics and political subjectivity. And that's why I think duties is not there, because duties enters back in the contract, which locks you back into that kind of giving of status. Now there is, of course, with this kind of approach, there is a limit. From an institutional perspective, it's massively limited, because sociologically you can make an argument that these sites exist. But somehow you have to look at this. It's one of the issues you can have with, I refer to the work of Peter Mayers, right? These clandestine people, organizations who work on clandestine immigrants, and then they just do direct action in bureaucracies and so on, so that their cases are heard. Of course, the whole ambivalence is, or the question is the idea of the act of citizenship to become part of the already instituted status? Then the question of duties comes in. Because when you want to become a European citizen with the same rights, you also have the duties that go with it. That's part of the citizenship discussion. So the site is an element of openness to enter in the contract that exists. I like the work that's being done from a more sociological angle, in which one says that it is never that. Because once you open radical sites of citizenship, and they're taken serious, radical sites where political being is articulated, it will actually be a renegotiation of the whole thing as well. So it will not just be the imposition that's there. And then you can have, but I need to retain that, because the duty question leads again to the old argument about just, you've got to pay taxes, or the other way around. We do pay taxes, so we actually have a right to be in there. Then you're already back in. You have to retain the openness, and therefore to have a sensitivity in the analysis and the knowledge you produce to the possibility that everything is up for grabs. Not everything, but things are up for negotiation. And then the question indeed becomes whether the contract model of citizenship is the only one. The duties versus rights that's there. But that's then another debate. But I mean, that's why this is not an argument against, it's an argument for retaining another place, another kind of conceptual framework, That's not prior, it functions at the same time. Because when you look at these cases, people make claims about rights, which draw them into the already existing statuses, hence the questions with duties, etc. that exists. Once you claim, I'm sure in the sex workers movement, I haven't looked at it in enough detail yet, but there are debates about if we have all these rights, this also means that we become part of the system, so there are certain things we can't do anymore. Or we have, therefore, to go to health checks, for example. So at that moment, so there is, somehow there is that element, but somehow there's also a desire to be distanced from it. And that's the messiness, indeed, about the side of acts of citizenship, I think. That one retains these ambivalences all the time. And so it's not the one or the other. But I agree, duties is an interesting one. I'll throw that on the table next time we have a workshop. That would be very interesting to see. Although I think the answer will be a bit like I've said now, but we'll see. You never know when you've got 6 people in a room.
More questions?
Yes?
Okay.
No, I like the presentation very much. Thank you. And I've been throughout your presentation thinking about how this links to Marshall and Soysal, of course. And of course, you've just been saying that it's precisely not the Marshallian or the Soysal approach, but it's in fact a completely different approach. And I like it very much because it in a way takes those two arguments and it moves it one step further out, sort of to the borders, because Soysal is talking about people who are already there. And simply the claiming of rights, and again falling under the various post-national citizenship models and so forth. And this simply takes it one step further, and I like that very much. But I did want to raise the question, you say citizenship for you is the right to claim rights. And I think that's wonderful, but then does that not then also create 2 or more classes of citizenship? Because you have different people who are engaging in different acts of citizenship by claiming different sets of rights, if that makes sense. And does that, or is it that one set of rights that inevitably leads to the next set of rights? So ultimately you have in some way a continuum of citizenship that once it is started on, you continue to move along. That was the one comment and question. My other question is about your comment that money is a great leveler. And I agree with you entirely, but at the same time, these migrants who are escaping dire poverty at home are the ones who actually have the money, who are able to pay the smugglers to get on the boats, or are able to get their villages together to collect the money and so forth, or who already have people in Europe who send remittances to pay the smugglers and so forth. So you are still talking about a relatively small subset of people who are able to engage in that act of citizenship. So those are my 2 comments. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. The first question, whether it's a stratification of citizenship. I'm not sure there is, in a way, because that would mean to assume that in the project it's built in, that European citizens who have European citizenship are somehow more citizen than those who don't have the rights and therefore are claiming to be recognized as political subjects. Did I understand that correctly? That cannot be done because that actually takes away how the science opens up to radical claims of equality somehow. And that can't, because that would then lead that, because then you do the continuum. And I think what's central, now this is not my concept, this is how we use Ayse's concept. The radicality of that concept is that things are open, always relational, between people, and therefore it's not only we claim the right to hold rights. Once you give us the right to hold rights, we step into your status. That's not what acts of citizenship are about. Acts of citizenship are about that the status itself becomes part of a political claim. That's why there's sides of enacting European citizenship, I think. So in that sense, I would resist the continuum. Which is the same answer, partly I give to you. There's an ambivalence if you look at what the actors claim. Some actors will claim indeed to have the status. Right? Partly of the sex workers declaration is indeed to say, why is our work not recognized as someone who goes self-employed and opens a shop and therefore can move within the EU and between cities? And we can't. So that would be like, we open this up, but we are actually wanting to step in the next one. But the concept of active citizenship as an intellectual project has to remain open for not being locked in the necessity for a continuum, because it would take away the radicality of the equality claims, and therefore, you're right, then you stratify and some will drop off. They will not have the capacity, unless they enter a desire for a continuum, for entering that what is already inside. Money, that's a bit, I mean, sometimes I wish to some extent I've resisted using money precisely because of all these elements, right? There's all kinds of critiques of money. And I was more happy to work with a merchant than this thing. But ultimately, if you read, the exchange relationship is based on an understanding of money in this kind of leveling effect in Simmel. And therefore mobility has to be based on that. But that does not necessarily mean, I think, and Simmel would not argue that either, that money is a universal leveler. That's a different matter. It's not because in the feudal relation someone can buy themselves free, that therefore they suddenly are at the status or at the position, social or sociological position that's equal to the Lord or to the ones who have more money than you are. So in that sense it's there. But your answer to those who don't have money is partly an answer that money is a leveler. It confirms it, because if they would have money, they could move. And therefore it is a leveler. It's because you don't have it. It's like those who can't sell their property rights or their rights of being bound to the land. They can't move. So they can't become merchants and travel and move, unless they flee, but then they become caught in the whole policing system that exists as well. So in a sense, money, partly of the way you present, it's partly that money is a leveler, but it doesn't mean that money is a universal leveler in the sense that everyone who has a bit of money suddenly will be able to be mobile. We know that's not the case. There's a lot of hierarchization and stratification in mobility as well. So, but there's a more complex thing about money. I mean, money doesn't mean, Simmel's whole element is based on the argument that money is just no value in itself. It's this kind of pure medium that doesn't contribute anything, doesn't add anything. That's of course not anthropological studies of money, so that's not how money works at all. It has substance to it. But for recovering mobility, I think it works. It has this element as well. And that's important for us. And from there on, then we can have a discussion about what money actually does. But the more important thing is actually to show some leveling effect that can be claimed in exchange relations. And thinking, bonding, not in terms of an organic, territorialized community. Basically thinking it in community, but think it in exchange. And see how can you actually make political claims on these grounds. And that's where we seek to come in how European citizenship debates are actually structured. Yeah, there was a question here first.
One thing that I found interesting in your idea of citizenship that open also space for thinking the struggle of people without citizenship to the enlargement of citizenship for all the inhabitants of Europe. For instance, there is often this discourse about competition between migrants and natives on labor market or for welfare benefits. But on the other hand, if you see the rights that are denied to illegal migrants are also in some way enforcing some devices that are creating a form of social control also on native people and deny some rights and taking away political space to native inhabitants. And what I would like to ask you is how this idea of citizenship can link with concrete struggle and how it can be useful to see this kind of struggle as a struggle not just for right of a specific group, but of enlargement of all of citizenship for all the people living in Europe.
Let me go through the example of the sex workers. That's why we look at that partly. That's why it's a kind of, it has a long tradition there, which is, let me start somewhere else, because no, maybe it's better to start somewhere else. There is no claim here that citizenship in its status discriminating, stratifying mode, the instituted one, is only enacted by governments or political institutions. It's also enacted by you and me, right? If we have that status. And indeed, the competition in the labour market enacts competition. Nobody says that the side of actual citizenship is a nice side to be in. That's not the point. That's often the thing. Yeah, you know, because we're there, and you reclaim this, you think it's a nice side to be in. It's not a nice side to be in. And there is, of course, competition, because people enact nationality. I mean, and therefore the element is structured. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that there's no, it's not an element about people being good and the state being bad. That's not the argument. It's an argument about practices and claims that are being made, and the difference in that and the tension there. But I don't think you implied that, but I just thought I'd clarify that. And the second element is, if you look at the sex workers, that's of course what they do. By saying, the debate I had is, by not distinguishing between migrants and EU citizens, by not distinguishing necessarily between those who are part of particular states where you can work and move around, and those who are not, but by leveling it, because we are part of an industry of our work. That's the traditional move that's made, right? It's a highly contested move. I can come back to that in the field. But that move is precisely aimed at getting rights extended for everyone, across the board, not just for those who are, like, say, in the middle. They're European citizens, but they live in Italy and or in a particular country where you cannot practice and you cannot move, or you cannot come in as an EU citizen to actually practice. So it's a leveling effect. So they are used in that sense. I think that's partly also, although I don't know the case very well, I haven't read up on it enough, on what the sans-papiers actually were claiming. Many claims that are done in these acts do claim radical equality, therefore they have to claim across the board. Which then does not mean, of course, that it resonates with everyone in the field. For example, in the sex workers field, it's not just the policing, and they also have, there's an ambivalence with, for example, the anti-trafficking movement, who actually has a tendency now to see sex workers basically as victims of a trafficking. They're also working with feminists to say that actually this is denigrating and works against the human rights of women. They're part of the field. It's not a field that's just between these people who sit here saying, we declare this. We can see the tensions, by the way, inside the declaration, if you look at it. And some institution, governmental institution, that we are not happy with. The field is horizontal, always. The politics are actually very messy in that way. And I don't think actual citizenship implies that you have, you know, these citizens, these institutions that are imposed and those that break open, because the breaking open is always controversial. But it's not neutral. Not everyone has the same power position in that one. For example, in Brussels, while they actually succeeded in the European Parliament to occupy a space, to be with quite a bit of people, draw in a lot of press, there was a counter-conference organized by feminist movements, or feminist MEP, who made an argument against sex workers being recognized. Now, at that point, they didn't draw attention. Now, that might be all things, say all kinds of things. But so, it's not that there's no struggle going on, and it's not the case that people mobilize in the same power all the time, right? And it's clearly the case that these people who mobilize here in actual citizenship often are those who are indeed, in terms of the capitals they have, to get a political voice, to receive political voice, are actually in a weak position to retain it and gain it. That's why for them it's not necessarily a nice side to be in, because they're often on the subordinated side.
There was a question on... More questions? One speaker instead of two, and we have exhausted him.
It's all right. It's not 4 hours, so you know.
So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank our passionate speaker. It was a pleasure to listen and to discuss these issues with you. And thanks to the public to have replaced the second voice by many other voices. Thank you.